Guten Tag, mein Name ist Carlos García Hernández von dem Lola Books Verlag. Vielen Dank, dass ihr alle heute gekommen seid zur Buchvorstellung von Modernes Geld Verstehen von Randall Wray, der heute mit uns hier in Berlin ist. Heute ist ein wichtiger Tag für unseren Verlag, weil wir die sogenannte MMT-Trilogie oder Modern Monetary Theory Trilogie endlich bis zum Ende veröffentlichen. Wir haben zuerst vor ein paar Jahren die 7 unschuldigen, aber tödlichen Betrügereien der Wirtschaftspolitik von Warren Mosler veröffentlicht. Das war das erste MMT-Buch auf Deutsch. Und Warren Mosler war auch mit uns in Berlin. Letztes Jahr war in Berlin Bill Mitchell, um sein Buch Dystopie Eurozone vorzustellen, mit einem Vorwort von Heiner Fleißbeck. Das war das zweite MMT-Buch auf Deutsch, das wir auch beim Lola Books veröffentlicht haben. Und endlich stellen wir heute Modernes Geld Verstehen vor, der Schlüssel zur vollen Beschäftigung und Preisstabilität von Randall Wray. Dieses Buch ist wahrscheinlich das wichtigste Buch, das wir im Bereich Modern Monetary Theory vorgestellt haben, weil in diesem Buch wurde für das erste Mal der Begriff modernes Geld benutzt. So, wir können ohne Zweifel sagen, dass Randall Wray der Vater von diesem Begriff ist und dieses Buch ist, wo alles entstanden ist. So, für uns ist ein Vergnügen, dass Randall Wray mit uns heute ist. Er wird gleich das Buch vorstellen. Danach wird Frau Doris Neuberger von der Universität Rostock zum Wort kommen und Randall wird danach antworten und danach wird Dirk Enz von der Pufendorf Gesellschaft auch zum Wort kommen und Randall Wray wird auch antworten. Danach werden wir ein kleines Q&A mit Ihnen haben, damit Sie auch die Chance bekommen, eine Frage zu stellen. Ja? Nach der Veranstaltung wird auch Randall Wray die Bücher unterschreiben, falls Sie die Bücher kaufen möchten. Nur das, jetzt ist Randall Wray an Bord.
Wenn die Ray wird in Englisch sprechen, brauchen Sie eine Übersetzung ins Deutsche? Könnte irgendjemand eine Übersetzung ins Deutsche haben? Okay, wenn das nicht der Fall ist, dann ist das ja ganz hübsch.
I was going to start with a short history of MMT because it is pretty short. It's only over the past 25 years or so that we've developed it. I didn't study economics as an undergraduate. I studied mostly psychology and sociology, social sciences more generally. I started studying economics in my late 20s when I was working for local government. And I was very fortunate that going to school at night, my local university, which was in Sacramento, California, if you know where that is, had a wide variety of kinds of economists there in the department. So from the very beginning, I studied what we call heterodox economics, which is the alternative to the mainstream approach, conventional approach to economics, which is dominant in Germany. It's really dominant almost everywhere, but it's more dominant here even than in the United States. So I had studied institutionalist approaches and Marxist approaches from the very beginning, in addition to the orthodox. So that is unusual to have that exposure when you first start in economics, and also to be older. so that I think I knew a little bit more about the way the world works than most students do when they're 18 years old studying orthodox economics, and they get very indoctrinated in the free market supply and demand approach to economics. So that didn't happen to me. There really wasn't a post-Keynesian in that department, but I did read Keynes's general theory from the very beginning. And one of my professors saw that I really enjoyed Keynes, and he said, you have to go study with Hyman Minsky, who is the greatest post-Keynesian alive. And so I did, and I went there to write my dissertation, well, to study and then write the dissertation. And after 2 years, I moved to Bologna, Italy, to finish the writing with Jan Kregel. Maybe some people here have heard of him. He's a younger generation than Minsky, but also a excellent post-Keynesian economist. And while writing it, I was focusing on private banking and the rise of what we called non-bank banks at the time, which is not a very good way to define something. Much later, Paul McCulley of PIMCO called them shadow banks. So we now know these as shadow banks. And I looked at off-balance sheet operations, which we now call all the kinds of derivatives and other kinds of activities that banks engage in. And while I was there, I met a German, Otto Steiger, who had come to give a lecture, and he had an alternative to the barter story of money that we all learned in our first year of economics. That is the idea that first there was barter and that was inconvenient, and someone had a bright idea, let's invent money as a medium of exchange. So he had a completely alternative view, and it was intriguing to me because it was somewhat similar to what I had found in Keynes's Treatise on Money, which is the 2-volume book he wrote before the general theory. And so because Steiger had cited another German, George Friedrich Knapp, I also read Knapp at that time. And Knapp's book was on the state theory of money. So this is something completely different from the barter story. And it was also consistent with what Keynes had said. Keynes adopted Knapp's approach in the treatise. So in my dissertation, I speculated a bit on the nature of money and on the origins of money, but for the most part, I was focusing on modern banking practices in that book, and that came out in 1990 as Money and Credit in Capitalist Economies. That was part of the development of what came to be known as endogenous money. The view that what you're taught in your money and banking classes, which is that banks sit around and they wait until they get a deposit and then they make a loan. And they are severely constrained by the reserves they have at the central bank. But there's a money multiplier process. Okay, so that, I don't know how many of you studied money and banking, but that was the conventional view of banks. It still is a conventional view among people who studied economics 30 years ago, a lot of policymakers, and even a few very misguided economists like Paul Krugman. No one who works in central banks accepts this idea anymore. They have all adopted endogenous money, which is what I was starting with in the 1980s. So that approach became very well known. That has to do with private money creation, and you come to the conclusion that banks can't ever run out of money. Okay, their only constraint is to find good borrowers who are going to make payments on their loans. They create the money when they make the loans. So there's an effectively infinite potential supply of money. The problem with this endogenous money approach is there was no role for the state. The most famous book was by Basil Moore, 1988. The state's not even mentioned in the book. The whole discussion is about private bank money. So I thought, we need to go back to Knapp. We need to look at the role of the state, and we need to talk about how does the state spend? Where does the state get its money? And so I was starting to try to do that and reading more on the history of money, reading what historians had written, reading what archaeologists had found, reading what anthropologists say about the way that earlier societies worked, and to try to figure out where money came from. The second person I met was in the early 90s, who was Michael Hudson. And Michael Hudson had been studying Mesopotamia. And he presented a theory in which the money is an invention of the authorities. It didn't come out of private markets. It was an invention of the authorities, a way to keep track, to keep records. It was an accounting device. And that fit with Knapp and also with Keynes. And so that also intrigued me. And that led to a very small group of us, I'm talking about less than 6, who started trying to integrate the state theory of money into a study of how government spending actually works. In the beginning, we called this chartalism, which is the term that Knapp had used, and people called us neo-chartalists. The mainstream view is that, of course, they prefer a small government that doesn't do very much. They want most activities to be guided by the market. The role for the government really comes down to monetary policy should control the money supply in order to fight inflation, and fiscal policy should be prudent. The spending ought to be very closely regulated by the amount of tax revenue. Of course, you can borrow, but that can lead to trouble, and you never should print money to finance your spending, because then you get hyperinflation. You become Zimbabwe or something like that. Well, all of this conflicted with what I had studied earlier when I was in my institutionalist days. I had read the great institutionalist whose name was J. Fag Foster, who had this very famous, among institutionalists, argument that whatever is technically feasible is financially feasible. In other words, whatever you know how to do, you can always finance it. If you know how to send a rocket to the moon, you can always finance that. The problem is technical know-how and resources. If you have those, you can always financially afford to do it. Okay? Well, if that's true, then how can we say that the government has to be limited by tax revenue? And it also doesn't fit with the view of money that comes from private banks that we were developing, which is essentially money is infinite. Banks can't run out of money. Well, why is it that the government, which is the most powerful institution we have in modern economies, by far the largest economic entity in every developed economy, why is the government constrained when banks aren't? That makes no sense. Okay? So in the second book, which is what was translated here in 1998, I focused on the sovereign spending and financing sovereign spending, and what are the true constraints to how the government, how much the government can spend. So it provided a different view. I also went back to my earlier work on the origins of money. By this time, I discovered the 2 best articles on money that ever had been written. It's 1913 and 1914 by a guy named Mitchell Innes, who was the Queen's ambassador to Washington, who had written a report on beekeeping and another report on incarceration. How on earth did he figure out how money works? The 2 best articles ever written. Anyway, his argument was that money has value because you need money to pay your taxes. It is taxes that give value to money. His argument is that has always been true. It is true even when your money is gold coins. They're valuable not because they have gold in them. And the value of the coins is not determined by the amount of gold in them. The value of coins is determined by the value that the state gives them when it accepts them in tax payment. That's what gives value to currency. So this was a completely different view. And around this time that I was thinking about these ideas and starting the book, I had met Bill Mitchell, who was already mentioned, and Warren Mosler online. And this was in the very beginnings of online discussions. And we discussed these ideas, and Warren was insisting taxes drive money. He had independently come to this just from his experience in bond markets. He had figured this out. He had figured out that the purpose of government bonds has nothing to do with borrowing. It's to essentially get currency out of the economy. That's the purpose of bond sales. And so in the small group we started working, and I published that book in 1998. As I was writing the book and working with the publisher, we were trying to come up with a title for the book. And we even had, so the publisher came up with ideas. We didn't like any of them. We actually met with a PR firm and talked to them, didn't like any of the ideas. And I said, well, what we're studying here is modern money. So why don't we just call it Understanding Modern Money? And the modern money part of that title came from a comment by Keynes in the Treatise on Money when he was discussing Knapp's work. And he said, I think Knapp is right about the way that money has worked for the past 4,000 years at least. Now, why did he say 4,000? Because that's as far back as archaeology had gone at the time that he was writing. And we have now pushed it back at least 6,000 years. So for the past 6,000 years at least, the way we describe the monetary system is the way that it has worked for the past 6,000 years. So as an inside joke, I called it modern money. In other words, we don't know what happened before 6,000 years. But for the past 6,000 years, we've had modern money. And the nature of money has not changed in the past 6,000 years. So it applies to that whole period. The book has been published in a number of languages, so now German, also Portuguese and Chinese, among others. In 2004, I published a book on the work of Ennis. Michael Hudson contributed a chapter to that one too, and called that The Credit and State Theories of Money. What Ennis had done that was that no one else had done was to integrate a credit theory of money, which seems to apply to banks, because that's what banks are doing, is granting credit, and a state theory of money, which applies to the government. He integrated the two and argued that actually even government money is credit money. Okay, he had that insight. I don't think anyone else had had that before. And so that's why it has that title. So my first book on endogenous money was accepted by heterodox economists, by institutionalists, post-Keynesians. Every book review of that book was positive, uniformly. And as I said, today everyone accepts that. This book, completely the opposite reaction. People hated it. You guys are crazy. You say the government can't run out of money. That's ridiculous. Okay? And those were our post-Keynesian friends. Not even just the mainstream. Everyone hated the book. In economics. But fortunately, I got invited to conferences of legal historians. People who knew the history of money and knew the laws that had come down to regulate money. And they accepted it. They said, yes, of course, that's right. I was once at a conference at Harvard where there was one other post-Keynesian economist. Everyone else was legal scholars. And he was trying to argue against my presentation, taxes drive money, and he was saying, when I accept money, I never think of the taxes I have to pay. And they said, well, okay, what do you think drives it? And he said, well, I accept it because I think I can fob it off on somebody else. You know, the greater fool theory. There's a greater fool out there than me that's going to accept this thing that has no value at all. And the whole audience laughed at him. They said, it's the taxes, stupid. Taxes drive money. That is what lies behind it. It's not a greater fool that you can maybe find someone dumber than you. And all he could do was to, as he left the stage, was mumble, well, maybe I have to think about this more deeply. Years later, I came across David Graeber's book. And I don't know if that was as big of a success here. You know, this is a book this thick. It's a bestseller in the United States. And he makes the argument that we've never found evidence anywhere of a society in which the economy is based on barter. Barter is either emergency behavior, the prisoner of war camps, or it is gift-giving and misinterpreted as barter-based markets. So he reaches the same conclusion that we do, that money is related to debt. Let me go on. Much more recently, and it was at the Harvard seminars, I met someone named Farley Grubb. Farley Grubb is perhaps the best expert on American colonial money. And he came to several of these seminars and he listened to modern money theory. He says, I don't do theory, you know, all I do is history and I study the coins. And in the past year, he's published 2 papers that are fantastic, in which he looked at the colonial issue of currency, and he found that every time the American colonies are famous for being the first governments in the West that issued paper money without gold backing. And even Adam Smith said, you know, it's very curious. Over there in America, they're doing this strange thing. They're issuing paper money, and it's accepted with nothing behind it. And then in the column in the edition that Bonar, the same guy who did Smith, said, as long as they don't issue too much relative to taxes. So anyway, Farley Grubb finds that every time they passed a law that authorized paper money, at the same time they imposed a new tax that was payable in the paper money. So the link is absolutely clear in the law. They knew what they were doing. You impose a tax and then you issue the currency that the population can use to pay the tax. That drives the currency. That is why people accept it. And then they imposed a high enough tax to withdraw most of the currency so that it wouldn't continue to circulate and possibly cause inflation. So they understood what they were doing. When they got the paper currency back, what do you think they did with it? Spend it again? They burn it. You don't spend tax revenue, you burn it. When the European kings got their coins back, sometimes they just melted them all down. Okay? You don't spend tax revenue. Tax revenue is for redemption of the currency. It is not for spending. Anyway, we were getting some recognition in the other disciplines, not very much in economics. Warren Mosler, Matt Forstater, Bill Mitchell, and I used to meet up, usually at one of Warren's places. and try to count the number of economists that we knew understood what we were talking about. And after 5 years, we were up to 6, counting ourselves. So there's 2 other people out there. After a decade, maybe we got beyond what we could do on 2 hands. Okay, it was extremely slow going, very, very rough. Back in 2007, we met in Vail and decided what we need to do is to write a textbook. And so Bill and I started in 2007. The book is going to come out this year. That's how long it took. Because Bill's busy writing other books, and so was I, and teaching and all the other stuff we do. So finally the book is coming out, and we're hoping this will help. But the thing that really has changed the acceptance of MMT was the blogs. And Bill's blog in particular, and then a little bit later, Stephanie Kelton's blog. That changed the impact just way, way, way beyond what I ever thought was possible. So here we are. Last August, the New Yorker magazine, I don't know if that means much to you, but this is what the elites in America read, you know. It actually had a crossword puzzle with MMT question in it. That shows you how diffuse the idea now is. And as you know, in the U.S. now, this is discussed by people who are running for office, and Bernie Sanders' main economics advisor is an MMT person, Stephanie Kelton. So it has really taken off, and there are now blogs all over the internet that are MMT blogs, and where there is discussion going on. So let me just finish with 10 main points that I include as being MMT. There, of course, everyone has their own definition of what you need to include. This is mine, my personal one. I think that Bill and Warren will agree with most of these, but probably not all of them. First point, what is money? Money is an IOU that's denominated in the socially sanctioned money of account. So it's an IOU, that's a debt, and it's denominated in a money of account. That money of account has to be socially sanctioned, which usually means today it's the state that sanctions it. The state says the dollar will be our money of account, or the euro will be our money of account. That has always been true. It's almost always the authorities that do that. There is one exception that I know of, which is when a group of banks got together and created a unit of account they used in Giro in Northern Europe. Other than that, they've always been authorities that choose it. And so this idea that money is a debt denominated in money of account comes from Knapp, from Innes, from Keynes, from a sociologist named Jeff Ingham, and from my professor Minsky. Second, taxes or other obligations. It could be fees, fines, tithes in the case of religious authorities, tribute in the case of conquerors. Some obligation has to drive the currency. Today, it's mostly taxes. But taxes were not important in Western economies before the 19th century. Fees and fines were more important than taxes. But today, for shorthand, we say taxes drive money, but it doesn't have to be taxes. So that's an important point, that fees and fines will do it too. The ability to impose such obligations is an important aspect of sovereignty. It's not the only aspect of sovereignty. Okay? The sovereign can put you in jail too. The sovereign can draft you into the army. But the ability to issue its own currency is very important to sovereignty. And usually only the state can do it. Okay? In the U.S., the Constitution says only Congress can do this, right? Anyone can issue money. The problem is to get it accepted. This is the exact phrase Minsky always used. Anyone can issue money. The problem is to get it accepted. Anyone can say, I owe you €5. Write it on a piece of paper. That is money if it's accepted. It's a debt denominated in the money of account. Let's see. Acceptance can be hard to get. What states do is they stand behind banks so that bank liabilities are very widely accepted. The problem for most other entities is the government doesn't stand behind them, and that makes it more difficult to get their liabilities accepted. That comes from Minsky. Fourth, the word redemption is used in two ways. You accept your own IOUs in payment. That's the first way. Or you promise to convert your IOUs to something else. That's the second meaning of the term. Most people focus on the second one, and they focus especially on the promise to convert government liabilities to gold. In other words, the gold standard. So when most people say redemption, they mean redeeming for precious metal. But that's very unusual. That's very specific, a very specific era in Western societies where we had a gold standard. And it really only lasted one generation. People think that that's the way it used to work 1,000 years ago. False. Did not. We had a gold standard for a very short period of time. The much more important use of the term is the first one. You accept back your own IOU. Okay, and that one is universal. Anyone who issues an IOU must accept it back in payment. If they don't, they just defaulted. They defaulted on their promise. That's the important one, and it is universal. This comes from Innes, Knapp. It's reinforced by Hudson, reinforced by Grubb. Those taxes that I said were imposed were called redemption taxes in the colonial American laws. They were called redemption taxes. So they knew exactly what they were doing. And also, if you want to read a more popular book, economics gets very boring, read Margaret Atwood. Her book called Debt and the Shadow Side of Wealth. Fantastic book. It's sort of the history of debt. Graeber's is the history of debt. If you want to read a 150-page version that's very entertaining, read Atwood. Don't read Graeber's very long book. Fifth, sovereign debt is different. The sovereign that issues its own currency and taxes to create a demand for it and does not promise to redeem it for gold or for US dollars, they don't dollarize, there is no chance of involuntary default on their obligation, because all they're promising is to take it back. That's an easy thing to do. There's no chance they're going to involuntarily default on the promise. Now, they might choose to default. Okay, that's a disaster. The King of England chose to default on his own tally sticks. He lost the power to issue his liabilities. He couldn't do it. No one trusted him anymore. The Parliament had to found the Bank of England to save him. Okay? The Bank of England came about because the king had defaulted on his tally sticks. So refusing to accept your own liabilities is a default, and that's a dangerous thing to do. And no rational government would do that. Six, we were talking last night about ABBA learners, functional finance. I think all the MMT people include functional finance as a fundamental component of MMT. The original formulation of learner is far too simplistic for me. If you know, there are two principles of functional finance. The first one has to do with monetary policy. He says just increase the money supply if you want to drive down the interest rate. And the second is if you have any unemployment at all, you either lower taxes or increase spending. It's too simple. Increasing government spending does not guarantee that you're going to increase employment. you will increase demand, but it could all be inflationary demand. So I think we need to be much more specific. What the government spends on matters. And if you want full employment, you ought to spend on employing people. Just increasing spending or reducing taxes might not do it. So the problem is not that the government can't always spend more when there's unemployment. Yes, it can. But is that going to solve the unemployment problem? Probably not. And for that, I would say all of the institutionalists are very important, and Minsky himself too. So because you can't just spend indiscriminately, the job guarantee is an important component of MMT. Okay, so that is how you make sure you get to full employment. And more than that, the job guarantee anchors the currency. Taxes give value to money. The job guarantee stabilizes the value of the money. It's the job guarantee that prevents inflation. So you have to have a job guarantee to anchor your currency and to ensure that it has a relatively stable value. Furthermore, using the job guarantee to get to full employment will allow you to go to full employment without causing financial instability. Minsky always worried that just spending more or reducing taxes will create inflation and also financial instability as you move closer to full employment. So you won't be able to stay at full employment. You're going to have a financial crisis that causes unemployment, or you're going to have unacceptably high inflation and the government is going to clamp down on the economy and slow it down. So you have to have the job guarantee in order to have full employment, price stability, and financial stability. The job guarantee is critical. So number 8, in MMT, I include Minsky's analysis of financial instability. So Minsky's most famous contribution was the financial instability hypothesis. He explains why capitalist economies tend to move to a point of financial fragility and then they crash in a financial crisis. Many people interpreted that as a business cycle thing, but Minsky had a much longer view of this. Minsky predicted the global financial crisis in the 1950s. Now that might sound ridiculous. How could you predict something that's not going to happen for 60 years? But he did. He described how the economy was going to transform over time to the point that we could have a crisis as bad as the Great Depression. Okay? And we almost did. So we have to have an analysis of financial instability in our modern money theory. And so I credit Minsky for that. The most bizarre claim I hear from critics of MMT is, oh, you guys never talk about the private banking system and financial crises. Absolutely false. I've written hundreds of thousands of words on the private financial system and financial crises, much more than I've written on modern money theory and the job guarantee. It's just absolutely false. We do worry about this. Okay, and where am I? 9. The government's debt is our financial asset. So government debt is not a bad thing to be avoided. It's the source of our net financial wealth in the private sector, in the non-government sector. So when the government runs a deficit, that means we're accumulating wealth. And that can't be a bad thing. That follows from the sectoral balances approach of Wynne Godley, who was a British economist. He is known as one of the wise men who advised the British government. So we have to get the macro accounting right. This has to be a component of modern money theory. Minsky also implicitly, in the back of his mind, always was stock flow consistent. Always had the accounting in the back of his mind. If a student came to his office with some wild ideas, he would say, go home, do the balance sheets, all the accounting, come back, and then we can talk. Because what you're saying makes no sense. Okay, you have to get the accounting right to make sure that what you're saying makes any kind of coherent sense. And then 10th, rejection of the typical view of the central bank as independent. The central bank is sort of a guardian to make sure the government doesn't spend too much money and cause inflation. The central bank is not independent, and it is not potent. Okay? The monetary policy is a very weak tool. People think that you can just abandon fiscal policy and use monetary policy to fine-tune the economy. They cannot do it. People think the central bank can control inflation and reverse course when you have deflation, as you've had in Europe. That's false. They don't have the tool to do that. They cannot do that. We don't really even know if raising interest rates slows the economy or speeds it up. We don't know if lowering the interest rate to 0 is going to stimulate the economy or cause it to continue to crash. Okay? I'll just put out there, and we can debate it later if you want. There is no empirical evidence to support this at all. There's no empirical evidence to support the belief that raising interest rates fights inflation. Okay? The correlation actually goes the other way. Raising rates is correlated with higher inflation. So what can the central bank do? It can't say no to the Treasury. So it actually does not have the tool to control government spending either. The central bank is the Treasury's bank. All payments are made through the central bank, and all payments to the government come through the central bank, but the central bank can't stop the government from spending because it's never going to bounce a Treasury check. The Treasury sends out checks on the first of the month to all your retirees. The central bank is not going to bounce those checks when banks submit them for payment. So there's no way that the central bank is going to prevent spending. Now, they might raise interest rates, fearing that government spending is going to cause inflation, but as I already said, that might be inflationary anyway, too, and it can't prevent the government from spending. So we need to give up the idea that they're independent in any matter except for setting the overnight interest rate target. And maybe it's even a bad idea to let them do that because they tend to do what the Fed just did. Raise interest rates as we go into a recession. The timing is impeccable. You can tell whether we're going to go into a recession or not because the Fed always starts raising rates when there's evidence we're heading toward recession. So impeccably wrong policy consistently. So we probably should take that away from them. So I'll stop with that 10th point.
I also agree that the history of money tells us a lot about taxes drive money and so on, and how money came into being, not as barter, not in a barter economy, but as a kind of tax keeper. I have one question regarding your argument that money is always debt, I owe you. What about cash, which is not covered by gold, for example? Is it also debt? Of course, in the times of Keynes and Minsky, it was backed by gold. But today, the banknotes or cash coins are not backed anymore. So this is an argument recently written by Martin Hellwig, who says it is a mistake to balance cash as central. So we should only balance the debt. money as debt. The other important question is, if you think of money as debt, shouldn't you think also about the productiveness of the assets behind this? Because any debt is also a claim, and the claim is backed by investments in the real sector. So the question is, why don't you discuss the kind of investments? For example, of course, the government can take as many debt as it likes, but if this money is invested as just transfers for consumption, there's no real interest rate created from these productive investments. And so we also have to think about unproductive investments in the financial sector, about asset price bubbles, for example, which do not create any value, any real value. It is right that money drives taxes, and this is an incentive for people to work, to gain an income, to pay taxes. I agree with this. But then it is important that the real sector is productive. And I also have some question about your policy conclusions. What are your main policy conclusions? You write a lot about employment and not your conclusions about money. So there's a kind of mixture between employment policy, fiscal policy, and monetary policy. Well, I wonder whether if you tell the politicians that they can create money and debt without limits, then they will use this argument to just spend whatever we like. And this will create inflation. And we have many cases in the history about hyperinflations in many countries, in Germany during the world wars, and in many developing countries. And so we have many examples that tell us this won't work if we have no limits. So where would you set limits? These are my main questions.
Do I go? Okay. All right. Good questions. So, is money always an IOU? Yes, it is. In using the first sense of the term redemption, what is it that the state owes you when it issues, let's say, paper money that has no backing? It's not promising you gold because there is no backing. It is promising you that you can get yourself out of debt by delivering the currency back to the issuer. Okay, so what the tax does is it puts all of you in debt. Now, in modern economies, only the sovereign government can do that. In old times, feudal lords could do it. A feudal lord could put you into debt too, and say, you know, I'll send around the knights and they're going to burn down your little hut if you don't pay the rent. Okay? But today it's only the sovereign that can do that. They can put you into debt by imposing tax obligations. It's like original sin. You're born in this country, you're going to owe me taxes. And here's the way you can get out of that debt. And there's only one way. You've got to pay me. Okay, and what do you pay? You pay my currency. Now, in modern economies, we have central banks. So what I'm describing is the way that it worked up to the point when we had central banks, because you actually did deliver back to the king his own IOUs, which were tally sticks and coins. But coins, despite what people might have learned in their high school history courses or what they see in museums, Most spending by sovereigns in Europe and most tax payments by the taxpayers in Europe were in the form of tally sticks, little pieces of wood. That was the main currency that was used. But it could be coins. In any case, the IOU is accepted back by the sovereign, and what he owes you is the right for you to get out of debt by delivering back to him his own IOU. So that's why I say it is an IOU. It's not a debt in the second sense of the term redemption today. They don't owe you gold anymore. Okay, now in some countries dollarize. Okay, so the second sense of the term does apply. So in Ecuador, the government promises when you deliver an Ecuadorian quarter to the government, they promise to give you an American quarter. Okay, but that promise is not common in developed countries anymore. Okay, so the second sense of the term doesn't apply anymore. And people who want to say that modern currency is not an IOU are using only the second term, okay? Which my argument is that was never important, okay? So Ecuador decides to do it, but you know that's an exception, not the rule. The second question on the productiveness, yeah, so if you think of money from the perspective of the government, the purpose of the monetary system is to move resources to the government's use. That's the purpose. And from the very beginning, that's why money was invented. It wasn't to facilitate market trade. Okay? In the beginning, money was invented as a way to move sheep and goats to the authorities. Okay? And so the monetary system exists to move resources for the government purpose. Okay? It's not necessary that the government is productive at all. Okay? Maybe all the resources the government uses go to fight unnecessary wars. Complete waste. Complete waste. It won't be inflationary as long as it's not removing too many resources from the private sector. Okay? Now, I'm not saying this is desirable at all. It's not desirable. It's much better that when the government moves resources to itself, it builds infrastructure to increase capacity. Okay? In which case, it could be deflationary. If the productive capacity is increased enough, you actually end up with far more production and productive capacity. And so the taking resources away isn't inflationary at all. So, you know, what do you want to do? You want to make sure that you don't move more resources from private sector use to government sector use. Then the private sector can, you know, produce and still satisfy their own needs. So how big should the government be? Okay, it should be just at the right size, that it's left enough for the private sector to accomplish what is perceived to be the private purpose. And that varies by country, so there's no, people will ask, should the government be 20% of the economy or 50% of the economy? It depends on what you think is the government's purpose and what do you think is the private purpose. So in the United States, we have a very small government. Our government's 20% of the economy. France, the government is 50% of the economy. So I would say the revealed preference of the voters is, in France, they want the public sphere to be much bigger and the government to supply much more. And the private sphere to be small and supply much less. In the US, it's just the reverse. Okay? I don't like it. I think it's unfortunate, but that's the reality. In the US, we want the private sector to do more and the government to do very little. In Europe, it tends to be the other way around. So How can you tell if the government is the right size? Well, are you accomplishing the public purpose and the private service both? If you're leaving the private sector short of the resources it needs, the government's too big. If you're leaving the public purpose unsatisfied, you're not doing all the things the government ought to be doing, then the government's too small. So that's how you tell whether it's the right size. Yes, there's unproductive spending by governments, by the financial sector, and also by what we call the real sector, the productive part of, in the United States, when we had the consumer debt bubble, so you could say there's financial sector excess there, way too much lending to households, right? And households going way too far into debt. At the same time, we built way too many houses in the wrong places. Okay? That now the bulldozers are just running through and bulldozing them all down. So that was a tremendous waste. And that was all the private sector. The private sector makes mistakes and the government sector makes mistakes. So I don't think this is just the government sector that wastes resources, spends on the wrong things. Private sector does it too. And then finally, the policy conclusion. So the job guarantee is a policy proposal that goes along with modern money theory that's a description of the way the monetary system actually works. But from my point of view, the job guarantee is not an optional policy. It's a necessary policy. Okay? It goes with our understanding of the way the monetary system works. And we have to have a job guarantee if we want full employment, price stability, and financial stability. We have to have a job guarantee. So that's a necessary component of modern money theory. What about other policies? I have lots of policies that I want. Say, universal health care. Okay. Is that essential to MMT? I think it's hard to argue that that is. Okay. We have mostly a private healthcare system, and it's pretty much of a mess. And there could be people who advocate MMT who don't think we need a European-style universal healthcare system. So each of us has, a list of policies that we like, but I would say that they're not fundamental to MMT. Depends on whether you're more progressive or Warren Moser and I disagree on lots of policies. Okay, I'm a progressive. He's much less progressive than me, much more conservative. So, I would like to shut down all the Wall Street banks. Okay, I think they're extremely dangerous. And Warren came out of Wall Street banks. Okay, and we have a difference of opinion on that. So we disagree on that kind of a policy. I would say that's not essential to MMT. Right? It's an additional thing that I put on. Okay, hyperinflation. Paul Samuelson gave this interview in 1974. You can Google it and find it. So Paul Samuelson is the most famous Keynesian economist of the post-war period, and wrote the textbook that some of you, if you studied economics in the 50s, 60s, through the early part of the 70s, you used Paul Samuelson. Okay? He gave this interview with Mark Blaug, and he said, there's an element of myth about the necessity to balance the budget. He said that it's like those bedtime stories you tell your children to scare them. You tell them about the wolves in the forest so that they don't wander off, right? You're going to get eaten. He said, we economists tell those kinds of stories because if we told politicians the truth, sounded exactly like what you said, if we told politicians the truth, they would spend like crazy and cause inflation. So basically, we have to lie to them. We lie to them and tell them the government can't afford to spend because we don't trust them. Okay? I have two problems with that. The first is I don't think it's my job to lie. I don't think it's the job of any professor to lie to their students. We have to tell the truth. If very occasionally it does happen, if I talk to a congressperson or their staff, I tell them the truth. I'm not going to lie to them and say, oh yeah, you got to balance the budget because the government's going to run out of money. Okay? No, you got to tell them the truth if you're an economist. We should be scientists. Second, it's simply not true. There's nothing politicians fear more than inflation. Nothing. In Germany, I know you won't disagree with me, okay, because it's absolutely ingrained in Germany, but it's also true in America. There is no politician who will purposely cause inflation. It will never happen, okay? They will always err on the other side. Even if they completely understand everything I say, they're going to worry about inflation. They're going to spend less than they should because of the fear of inflation. So I just don't buy the argument. I think Samuelson was wrong. This is not true. Tell the truth and say, yes, there is a danger. You spend too much. You go beyond full capacity. It will cause inflation. Okay? And that's a very rare event anyway. And the only time the U.S. had high inflation before the oil price shocks was in wars. Every war, we had a high inflation, except World War II. Okay, why didn't we have one? Because the government knew it was going to be taking a huge portion of the resources away from the private sector. Turned out it was 50%. 50% of all the production in the United States in the war went to the government. Okay? They knew that would be inflationary. So what did they do? They had price controls. To increase your price, you had to get permission from John Kenneth Galbraith. He ran the price setting office. And he realized that you had to set all the prices. In the beginning, they thought you only set the prices of the output of the biggest firms. And then they found out, no, that's not true. You got to set them all. So you prohibit price increases. They used rationing. So you had to have ration coupons to buy the key resources if you're a consumer. You know, rubber and silk and sugar and all that they needed for the war effort. And the third thing they did was patriotic saving. They sold war bonds. Why did they sell war bonds? Because the government needed the money? No. The government understood perfectly well they don't need the money. They're spending by creating money. The war bonds are to get you to not spend on output. So patriotic saving reduced consumption, and that prevented inflation. World War II was the first time we didn't have any inflation in a huge war. Okay, so we know how to do it. That's what you do. So it could be a war, but it could be something else. It could be a natural disaster. Okay, it could be global warming and the seas rise and, you know, Denmark's in big trouble. Netherlands. So you could have to move a lot of resources to the government sector for something that's not a war. What do you have to do? You got to do the kinds of things that Galbraith did to prevent inflation. Last point. Hyperinflation actually is not common. Hyperinflation is extremely rare. It has never happened in a developed capitalist country that did not have a severe political crisis that caused severe disruption of supply. It has never happened. We've never had the case of low inflation becoming moderate inflation, becoming higher inflation, becoming hyperinflation. That has never happened. Never happens. Okay, that's the great fear. But there's no case of that ever happening. Yes, we've had inflation creep up to 40% per year. Okay? Economists can't find any negative economic impacts of that. The political impacts are big. People don't like high inflation, but there's no economic impact of that. But those don't become hyperinflation. They can remain high for a very long time. Israel has high inflation for a very long time. You all know Brazil. is very inflation prone, and they can operate with very high inflation for a long time. Those don't become hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is a rare event. Okay, not Germany had one, I know that. But Keynes had an analysis that the economic consequences of the peace that basically predicted the war reparations were going to be withdrawing supply, and the German government had a choice between paying the reparations and letting the population starve, or paying the reparations and trying not to let the population starve, and they chose the second one. And the result was hyperinflation. The Zimbabwe, Bill Mitchell in a blog and also in the textbook that's coming out goes through the Zimbabwe and two other hyperinflation experiences in detail. It's always a supply side problem. In Zimbabwe, the problem was they tried to redistribute the productive land. So it had all been in the hands of the whites. They redistributed it, and production collapsed. And then the government couldn't, or manufacturing couldn't get imports because the value of the currency was going down, and through the exchanges they couldn't buy enough imports. So manufacturing also collapsed as a result of a collapse of the agricultural sector. And so that was the problem. If your supply collapses, then you could have hyperinflation. So those are not common events, and it's never happened in a developed capitalist country.
Yeah, well, my name is Dirk Ins, and I'm at the Pufendorf Gesellschaft for Politische Ökonomie. We're going to have a conference here in Berlin next door at the IBC Hochschule on February 1st and 2nd on MMT, basically. So you're all invited to join us at that event. This is before I start talking about the book. I read the book probably 10 years ago, I think. And I just want to tell you a little bit about why I read it and what it did to me. So because I'm basically the only German MMT economist, if you want. So I met Randall Wray probably also in 2010 or something at one of those Keynesian conferences. So I started my academic career at Göttingen University, which is very mainstream, and we had a couple of lefties also. I remember that Wolfgang König was doing the development economics seminar, being very heterodox, so many different theories. But there was not really a Keynesian kind of education, so nobody talked about how banking would work or how the state actually spent money. They all supposed that it was basically financed by a golden credit card or something. So the question was not answered. But I was very interested in development economics, so I thought about doing a PhD, and I did that. So I wanted to write about the influence of multinational corporations on the local competitors, so basically a typical globalization kind of topic. So I started doing economic geography, which is basically looking at the economy on a level where you have no exchange rates because there's no different currencies. It's called regional economics or economic geography or rural economics. And I did a little model, and in my model there was barter. Okay, so one region had an agglomeration with industrial goods, and the other one had a lot of agriculture. And then I was looking at stability and what kind of trade would result. Would there be symmetry? So both regions are producing industrial goods and also agricultural goods, or would industrial production move to one region because there's increasing returns to scale, and then it's kind of a better solution that they import all the agricultural products and they export all the industrial products, and then they're all better off. But I found out after finishing writing my PhD thesis in 2007, I saw that it's somehow strange that the trade account is always in balance. Okay, so because you're bartering, your exports are bartered against your imports, but there's no money. There's no money in the model at all. But in 2007, there was this thing going on in Germany and also on the global level, these so-called macroeconomic imbalances. I think by then it was called the twin deficits, the current account deficits. So on the global level with China and Germany being very huge net exporters, and also on the European level in the Eurozone, where countries like Greece imported quite a lot. So I thought, well, it's kind of sad. You have these economic geography models, but you cannot talk about the problem of unbalanced current accounts. And I thought, so how is it possible actually to have a current account deficit? So how is it possible for a country to consume more than it produces? To understand that, you need to understand money. So I started, basically, I waited for my PhD thesis defense because the professors didn't get to read it. My thesis only like 9 months later, they said, okay, we're done. I don't know whether that has something to do with my thesis, but anyway, so I had lots of free time, and I started reading into Keynes, and I started reading Axel Leonhoff, who was writing about money contracts, and there would be a web of contracts in the economy, so if one defaults, the other one can pay off number 3, and so on. So I read Richard Koo, and then the first MMT book that I found was Understanding Modern Money, and I read it, and I thought about it, and I said, that can't be true. I said, if what they write in that book is true, then basically everything that they taught me so far is wrong. It's plain wrong. So it's not that this is like just slightly wrong, or there might be some qualifications to it. No, but then it's completely wrong. So I remember that as a student, I was taught the so-called ISLM model. You don't have to know what it is, but it says if the government increases spending, then the interest rate goes up. And now when I read Understanding Modern Money, and you think about it, the government spends money. That means that banks have more money. They don't know what to do with it, so they go to the money market and try to lend it to somebody. But because all the banks have more money, then of course they try to lend it to somebody. Well, where's the demand for that money coming from? Nobody wants to borrow. If all the banks have more money because the government just spent a couple of billions maybe. So the interest rate on the markets goes down, not up. And then central bankers, in other papers, central bankers say, yeah, that's true. So the book was really a revolutionary book for me, because I really took a lot of time to read it and think about it, then talk to my PhD student colleagues who I bothered with this book, and they basically said, well, it's a curious book, but they were basically saying we're not interested. I don't think that they wanted to follow an academic career, perhaps, but I was trying to find out how things worked, and the book opened my mind. So it's very interesting to read the book and see all these historical examples, because it shows you that this is not the neoclassical theory is always very abstract. Okay, so money demand equals money supply. So if you ask what is money actually, they say, well, there's lots of definitions here, and you forget your original question, and then you say, well, in the end, I don't understand what it means when you talk about monetary equilibrium. What is that? And of course, your primer does answer that, by the way. So there's more books now. But in this book already, you get the right kind of idea that something's wrong with the way that economics is taught, and something is seriously wrong. So at universities, they still teach economics as if we would live in a barter world where we have agricultural products that we produce ourselves. And then, of course, it kind of makes sense to have banks which are collecting the savings, so the surplus goods, and then they lend them out, the goods themselves. So it's a real kind of story to saving and investment. That would make sense in this kind of agricultural world. But in the modern world, and we talk about modern money going back 6,000 years, in this kind of world, it doesn't make sense to use neoclassical theory to talk about the real world. So I started thinking about this in 2007 when the subprime crisis also started. So I started writing a blog on what happened, and my first ideas were pretty wrong. When I read them now, I go back to my blog and say, okay, some of these ideas were pretty wrong, but at least I had some lines were correct, and I developed my thought, and it's kind of fun to go back and see how I evolve. But now I have to say that the book is very impressive. It was impressive back then, but now it's even more impressive because it makes some pretty important points. And I remember that back in the 90s when I studied economics, the economists basically said the state, number one, doesn't matter too much, and number two, it should be small and insignificant. And that's what we learned because capitalism won, communism collapsed. But there was, of course, that story that was connected also to the end of history and so on. And that book makes a very forceful argument that the state is fundamental to the economy. It's not something like a small little thing that you add to the economy. No, it's constitutional. So without the state, there's no state money, and without state money, I mean, I debated a guy from Hayek-Gesellschaft in December, and the people from the Hayek-Gesellschaft, they have this problem that they don't understand money. And they belittle it, and they say, well, money can be privately produced, and then we should do that. But of course, it would be that's a very radical policy to say that we switch to private money, so that if the state wants to spend, it needs to borrow from private persons. That's the same with the Bitcoin people. They don't understand money. Bitcoin is not progressive at all. Okay, so you cannot have a welfare state when you have Bitcoin. It's very unlikely that you would get that outcome. So this book basically is fundamental because thinking about the economy, it starts with money. I understood that only when I read that book, because I sucked when I was a student in macroeconomics. I remember that when I was doing my first exam in macroeconomics, there was the question, what happens to the economy if the interest rate goes up? And I thought, well, then you attract more foreign capital and it's expansionary. But of course the ISLM model that was in use, that there is no external sector, so that's wrong. Interest rate up means, in the theory, investment down, and it's contractionary. So I got a 4.0, which was my first grade. So I thought, well, macroeconomics is not a lot of fun. And then I did another macroeconomics class in my diploma, in my master's degree. Again, I struggled. I did not understand what they meant by monetary equilibrium, and it was very abstract, and I said afterwards, macroeconomics is not for me.
This is why I'm a microeconomist.
So I tried to become a development economist, you see, doing economic geography and so on, but then I got interested in money. And this is basically how I turned around, and then this is something which I really understood, that if you want to be an economist, whatever color you want to become later on, but it starts with money. If you're an economist and you can't understand, you cannot explain how money works, you're not a good economist. That kind of monetary system, when you basically go from small monetary matters, you go to the whole economy, you basically aggregate up, then of course you get this system-wide perspective, and then you understand many things that you never understood before. So when I taught my class in MMT, basically, I taught it 7 times already in Germany, and mostly to students who were new to economics, so first semester students or students who were coming from other faculties. And if I teach it to them, I have a lot of success, because most of the stuff is really reasonable. Okay, so the idea that if you introduce a currency, then somehow you say people have to pay taxes in some kind of currency. Well, where's the currency coming from? Of course the state has to provide it. Or the state has to say there's a private currency and I accept that for payment. Okay, so all these things are very easy to explain to students, and they like it. And there's a lot of critical questions, like the questions that you asked, of course, not that elaborate, but the same kind of questions. So what about economic growth? What about development? What does it all mean? But this book basically gives you a good foundation to understand those matters. And that is what I liked. But I wanted to add 2 more things. I want to talk just very briefly about Georg Friedrich Knapp, George Frederick Knapp, because he taught here in Berlin in 1895. For the first time he was delivering here his lecture on money, which ended up in the book, The State Theory of Money in 1905. So it was pretty interesting that he did it here in Berlin, actually. And similarly attended the seminar, the philosopher who wrote The Philosophy of Money later on. And Knapp also said that his ideas, well, he didn't say that explicitly, but he said his ideas are not new. And I would agree. There's something which is called tax foundation, I think it would be the English translation, Steuerfundation. So it goes back to at least the 15th, 16th century, that basically, even in Adam Smith, you find this idea that paper money, if the prince says that it can be used for tax collection, that paper money can gain some kind of value. So basically, Knapp and the chartalists, they basically focus on something which was basically well known over the preceding centuries, and it only somehow became forgotten, probably in the 19th century. And then there was this nice time in the early 20th century when you have people like Wicksell talking about bank deposits being created by the stroke of a pen. Then you have, that was 1898. Then you have Knapp writing about the state theory of money, that the state is the creator of money, and hence it's not really a debt, but you're just spending money into the economy and then you're getting it back later on. You have Schumpeter writing about the private sector and development, economic development. And then you have Keynes writing about all kinds of things about fundamental uncertainty and what causes unemployment, the lack of demand. So there was this nice high time of macroeconomics from 1900 to 1930 roughly, where economists really understood how things work. And it's kind of strange that 100 years ago, more or less, we have been to the point where this kind of lecture would have been a lecture where the audience is sitting there saying, yeah, okay, we know all this, we know all this. Okay, so it's kind of strange that we lost all that. And yeah, I'm fighting for many years now also to bring back this kind of knowledge. Of course, modern monetary theory has added lots of stuff on the original formulations by Knapp, which are not many. So Knapp was very conservative in his book. He never said that government spends first and taxes later. But I read a book review from 1906 where Vogt is his name, and a German economist said that this is what is implied. Okay, he said Knapp didn't write it, but it implies that if the government wants to spend, it can just do so, and later on, through taxation, collects back the money that it spends into the economy. There's no lack of money then, whatever you want to spend on. So the economists back then understood what was going on, and with the two world wars, it completely dawned on them that this is how it works. I think it's important to bring that back because we have a lot of economic troubles, and of course we should base our ideas and also the political decisions and the political arguments, we should base them on the best theory that is available. Okay, whatever comes out in terms of the arguments. So I agree also that MMT is a theory, a scientific theory. It's not a political program, but of course you can build a political program arguing with MMT that this is how things work. And I would basically say that this is probably a very fruitful approach for the future to try to persuade people that they follow this kind of theory. So my last point, in order not to make it too boring, is that I read a book review once of your book, the English version. It was written by Heiner Gansmann in 2015. Heiner Gansmann is a sociologist. Actually, he was a sociologist. He died last year. He lived in Belziger Straße, right next door. In order to remember Heiner Gansmann, who was a very good sociologist, an excellent one, I basically put some of his questions to you. I wrote them up in German, so I have to think a bit to translate them. So Gansmann says that in your book there's three big topics. Number one, all money is credit. Number two, all money is charterless. Number three, taxes drive money. That's, I think, what you explained. And he basically said regarding one, if you have money that is spent by the government, it's basically a tax credit. So is that also a credit when you say all money is credit? I think you explained that already. So he's asking, that's probably a German kind of thing, is there a difference between credit as a credit or credit as a loan? So in what sense do you mean all money is credit? That was one of his questions. Number two, on some Pacific islands, they use stones for money, and when they had a lot of stones, they just put them up for display. Okay, so these stones were used as money. So question again, is it true that all money is charterless? Again, it depends on the definition of money that you explained it. And the third question, which I found intriguing, is regarding this idea that taxes drive money. So what exactly do you mean by drive money? Some people say that, for example, the income tax is progressive and it depends on your income. So the income tax does not make you work or does not make you accept payments to yourself, because whatever kind of income you have, the tax that you pay is less. So in that sense, you cannot say that taxes drive money. So he says, is it maybe not private debt, which is basically people who are indebted to banks because they took out bank loans to buy real estate, and is this not maybe forcing them to accept payments to themselves, or this is basically what increases the monetary supply? So in the end, Gansmann is asking you, what do you mean exactly by drive money? And that's these three questions that basically Gansmann puts to you. I have none myself because I'm okay with your book. So.
Okay, on the first one, so currency is a tax credit, and in fact, I think that's exactly the way Warren puts it from the very beginning. So here we're giving you a credit you can use to pay your taxes. So if you have a wagon, the government needs a wagon for the military, the government says, I want your wagon here. I'll give you a tax credit. You can pay your taxes later. Okay? So I think that that's good. That's a good way to think about it. What about the bank loan? The one difference is that the tax liability is not something you've decided you want. Nobody volunteered, hey, please put a tax liability on me, okay? So the difference is you go to the bank and you say, I'm willing to go into debt. Okay, now why? Well, you want to buy a car, okay? So it's a voluntary thing. Now, we can debate how voluntary is it. You know, you really need the car, you got to go to work. From your perspective, the car is absolutely essential. So voluntary might not be the right word, but there's some discretion in whether you're going to get into that debt. So that is a big difference, but otherwise they are the same thing. What you are getting is a deposit, and that deposit lets you buy the car, okay? So the deposit becomes a deposit of the car dealer.